Hey guys, welcome back to Falcon Central Radio Show on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I'm Aaron Freeman, one of your co-hosts over at FalcFans.com. I'm joined by Scott Karasik, who covers the Falcons and other things for SportsNot.com. We are back to recap the Atlanta Falcons 2016 NFL Draft. We will be answering all your guys' mailbag questions. You guys sent in a ton of them, and we'll basically devote the show to answering your guys' mailbag questions because pretty much any way that we can slice up this draft, you guys asked the question, so we'll jump right in. As you guys know, the Falcons ended up with 6 picks. They started out with 5. They were able to trade back, get up an extra 6th-round pick. Obviously, their selections were the Florida strong safety Keanu Neal, LSU middle linebacker Deion Jones, Stanford tight end Austin Hooper, Minnesota weak side linebacker Devondre Campbell, San Jose State left tackle, now offensive guard Wes Schweitzer, UCLA wide receiver / kick returner Devin Fuller. So let's jump in it. We'll go pick by pick, basically. And a lot of people's questions about Keanu Neal, the Falcons' first-round pick, who they took with pick 17, were sort of devoted to asking the question of whether we thought that Neal was a reach at 17. Charlie Rogers, 68, asked, do you think Neal would have been available at pick 50? He appears to be a headhunter. Charlie has a second part of that question. We'll get to that later. Khalil, the Gemini Unrulies, asked, do you think Keanu Neal would have been available in the second round? So, Scott, where do you fall on those two, that big question? Do you think Keanu Neal would have been there at 50?
I don't. Everything I heard from the Steelers said that they would take him at 25. Like, he was the guy at 25, pretty much no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where going into the draft, I heard a lot of first-round buzz for Keanu Neal in the late first round. I didn't really buy it, but basically how the draft kind of fell, I'm looking back, I'm like, okay, maybe there was a little bit of smoke there that he probably wouldn't have lasted to pick 50. I don't know if he would have been a first-round pick, but there's probably a good chance that he would have gone off the board very early in the second round at the latest. So the Falcons taking him at 17, I think you can certainly make an argument that it was a reach, because personally, I don't see Keanu Neal as like a top 20 talent at safety. And so you can make that case. But in terms of being able to get a guy that's an instant day one starter in the first round, if that's what you're judging it by, as opposed to, sort of this more, fluid talent evaluation, then I don't think he was a reach in first round.
I think for the fit, for his athleticism, that's why they like him more than anything else.
Yeah. So, Jelani234 asks, Scott, how do you feel about the Keanu Neal pick?
As far as fit, as far as the starter, I love it. I knew Keanu Neal was going to be a Falcon coming into today. I had no idea why they wouldn't have wound up with Keanu Neal. Even in the second round, I could have seen them trading up.
Yeah, I think someone asked us last week, or maybe I can't remember who came up with the question, but, who did we see as a lock to be a Falcon? And I think we both picked Keanu Neal as someone who had a extremely high probability of being a Falcon. I think the Falcons, if you're going to be as judgmental as some people like to be, then maybe the Falcons made sure that they got the guy that they wanted all along, maybe a few picks earlier than they should have. The idea that maybe the Falcons could have traded back 7 spots or 10 spots and still got him, that might be true, but the reality is you can't just, we want to trade back and then just someone has to want to trade up. And unless I'm mistaken, I don't recall anybody trading up into the middle of the first round to get any player. So it's not like there are a lot of trade options for the Falcons to really explore. So, maybe they reached on him, but I think they got a really good player that will potentially be a fixture in our secondary for many years to come. Which, speaking of it, ATL Sports 404 asks, is the Falcons secondary now set for the future, or could they make a free safety a priority in 2017? And that was the second part of Charlie Rogers' question: is Ricardo Allen set to be our free safety?
I think Ricardo Allen this year is set to be the free safety. I think maybe even next year he's set to be the free safety. Do I think long-term Ricardo Allen? I don't even know. To be honest with you, I don't really have a way to go after that. Like, I think he should until they absolutely need to replace him. Till he's one of the worst starters on the defense, then yeah, that's when you replace him. But right now, I mean, let him learn, let him grow, let him start this year. I think he's a good fit. I think he's a good player. So that's what I mean. I like Ricardo Allen now. I just don't know if long term. I think next year, maybe the year after, they draft a guy who played cornerback primarily, fast as hell, but doesn't have the man coverage skills. Is more of a zone corner and says, you know what, this guy can hit. He's a good zone corner. Let's move him back to safety the way that the Seahawks did with Earl Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, with Ricardo Allen, I like Ricardo Allen too. I was an advocate of the Falcons taking a free safety this year, someone like Carl Joseph or Justin Simmons, just because if I was to bet money on whether Ricardo Allen is going to be long-term free safety, I would probably bet against it. But I do think this year is sort of his sort of make or break year. Like, if he's going to be the long-term fixture, we should see it. We should see significant improvement from him this year. I think last year, considering that was basically his rookie year, he was playing a brand new position, learning a new scheme. The fact that he basically graded out to be an average NFL starter was certainly a success. That certainly is one of the bigger successes that Dan Quinn was able to bring to Atlanta last year on the defensive side of the ball. But if that's all he's ever going to be, if that's his ceiling, then at some point the Falcons are going to have to upgrade their free safety. Now, whether that's next year, whether that's the year after, I don't know. But if he's just another year as a league average safety, which isn't bad for a 5th round pick that's a 5'9" corner. No one's complaining about that. But in an ideal world, that type of player is best suited to be a third safety, a dime safety, a backup. Given the injury-prone nature of the safety position, that's an ideal backup as opposed to a guy that you want to pencil into your starting lineup for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. So, I will hold out some hope for Ricardo Allen. I'm not going to sit here and bet the farm that he's going to be a fixture in his secondary for many years to come. But if it does happen, I won't be shocked by it. And if it doesn't happen, it's kind of, it could go either way. It's a coin flip sort of situation.
I mean, he either gets good this year, like really good this year, or he winds up, replaced next year. Like, that's pretty much how it goes down. I think I said the same thing about Warlow last year was he's either got to take that step or they're going to find someone better. And this year they found 2 guys better, I think, in Campbell and in Jones.
Okay. So, let's move on to that topic. We got a couple of people asking questions specifically about Jones and Campbell. Let's go with Deion Jones because he is slated to play middle linebacker, which is going to be somewhat of a position switch for him. Falcons ATP asked, why are people okay with a 222-pound middle linebacker?
Because his frame looks like long-term can be around that 235, 240. Eventually, he will be up to that 235, 240. Eventually, he will keep all the speed that he's got and be that same. Like, he'll be a 4.5 guy instead of a 4.4 guy, but he'll be 240, or 235, 240, and be a big, strong, or be a strong, fast, intelligent in coverage linebacker. I mean, I like him. I think he's a good fit. I thought he was about a round early because of his weight, because he's not great versus the run right now. But I think you can learn how to be good against the run. It's not that he's not physical for lack of trying to be physical. It's that he's not super physical because he doesn't have the pure strength behind him right now. He needs to gain weight. He needs to get stronger. It's a strength issue, not a physicality issue, in my view, at least.
Okay. I got to be completely honest. This is probably out of all the Falcons picks, this is probably my least favorite pick, Deion Jones in round 2. And especially now that he's moving to middle linebacker, I'm a little more wary on the fit than I was the day we drafted him, when I assumed that he was going to be groomed as Sean Weatherspoon's replacement at weak side linebacker. I am a little concerned about the weight. I know D-Led tweeted out either today or yesterday that he's up to 230 according to Dan Quinn. I do wonder a little bit how well he's going to be at putting on weight and keeping on weight. You know, he entered LSU as a 200-pound linebacker, exited it as like 219.
LSU's got an awful strength program, though.
I wouldn't say they have an awful strength program. I would say
they're not one that helps guys gain weight, because there's not a lot of guys who gain a lot of weight when they're there.
No, I think for the linebackers, they don't really care about those guys gaining weight because their scheme is sort of built on maximizing speed at the second level. So I would say that they don't really give a crap about whether they're playing with 215-pound linebackers or 230-pound linebackers, as long as they're fast. So I do think that's a feather in Deion Jones's hat. But it does concern me a little bit that this offseason, knowing that he was coming into the NFL and know that teams were going to question his weight, the fact that he basically only really gained like 3 pounds between the Senior Bowl and the Combine, that does concern me whether or not he's going to be able to keep on weight. You know, we'll see. I think whether he's 230 or 235, I don't think it really matters. I think he's always going to play like a 225-pound linebacker. So I think he's always going to be considered a little undersized, regardless of what he's listed at. And I think the only way that works is if his speed allows him to make plays that normal bigger linebackers wouldn't make. So I think you give a little in terms of the size department and you gain a little bit in the speed department. I think that's probably the best case scenario. But, you know, his fit at middle linebacker, I don't really like it that much, but we'll see how it turns out. I mean, you know, a lot of people, including myself, sort of are of this mindset of anybody but Warlow. So, you know, I'll give him a chance and we'll see how he fares. He'll have that opportunity. Let's see. Do we have any follow-up questions? Okay, yeah, we got a question from Delible Think. He says, do you still predict Warlow starts? What are Jones or Campbell's biggest obstacles to replace him by week 1?
I think it's going to be the best 2 linebackers in the eyes of Dan Quinn. I don't think either guy is really a truly set as middle linebacker or weak side linebacker just yet. Because he was saying today he views them as interchangeable spots. And I think that's safe to say, that they are going to be looked at as somewhat interchangeable. You've got similar responsibilities. They both have to guard guys in coverage. The difference, I would say, would be is that the middle linebacker is more of a 2-tech and the weak side linebacker is more of a 1-tech. But other than that, they are about the same. Or 2-gap versus a 1-gap. I mean, I do think that Weatherspoon, I do think that Warlow will be given shots. I think Wheeler will be given a shot. Between the 3 of those guys, they should have one of those starting spots down. Whether it's middle, whether it's weak, those 3 guys should take one of them. And I do think Deion Jones takes the other. Now, do I think that he's going to view Leo and Sam in a similar way? That's the long-term question. Because I think that I do think Dan Quinn could look at Leo and Sam and say, you know what? You guys line up left or right, whatever you're most comfortable with, and then we'll go based on how they align where we're going to put you, whether your hand's in the dirt or not on the end. Because they basically line up like it's a 3-4 offset as opposed to a 4-3 offset, and then the Leo just puts his hand in the dirt.
Let's talk a little bit about. Well, let me answer the question, I guess. I don't expect either rookie to start week 1. Now, whoever is playing weak side linebacker, there's a decent chance they could start just because there's a better than average chance that Sean Weatherspoon's already in the training room and injured by week 1. But in terms of just coming in and right away winning the job outright, I don't see that happening. It's possible it could happen. I wouldn't predict it. I sort of, my general rule of thumb is sort of how you transition from high school to college is going to be how you transition from college to the pros. And oftentimes with a guy like Deion Jones, who was a backup for 3 years, Devondre Campbell, I think was a backup for 2 years, that jump in competition is comparable. And I think with that jump in competition, I think both Jones and Campbell are probably going to be primarily special teams guys and backups. I'm sure that they will get opportunities to play on defense. I'm sure that they both will start games this year. I don't necessarily see that happening week 1 unless there's an injury issue. But I do feel like probably the Falcons are just going to basically get them opportunities, get them limited opportunities, get them limited reps this year with the idea that next year when Weatherspoon and Wheeler and Warlow are all free agents, they'll probably let at least 2 out of 3 of those guys walk, and then they'll plug Jones and Campbell into the starting lineup and play it by that point, and that's when those guys get their permanent starting opportunities. So I'm not as optimistic as everybody else that we got some instant impact linebackers, but I do feel like both those guys will get opportunities at some point in the next year or two to start, and it's going to ultimately boil down to their ability to take advantage of those opportunities to whether or not they will remain starters.
I think they both end up starting in coverage, like no matter what, starting as nickel linebackers. Like, I don't think they start, but I do think that in the nickel set, I think Deion Jones starts, don't get me wrong. But I think in a nickel set, you're going to have Jones and Campbell out there because as of right now, they're your best coverage guys.
That is a fair statement. Let me see. What do we have? What do we got about Devondre Campbell? The Truth asked, could Devondre Campbell push for a major role at middle linebacker given our current situation?
I think so. I really do. I think that's going to be his best fit long term. Just like I think Deion Jones' best fit long term is going to be weak side linebacker. But like I said before, you're going to have a pair of linebackers in there on nickel sets that can cover. And I think Campbell and Jones are both out there. And I definitely think like Campbell's in there covering tight ends.
Okay. If I'm going to make a prediction, my prediction will be along what I just said. I think as of right now, I sort of don't see either Jones or Campbell starting at middle linebacker for this Falcon long term. I think what's probably going to end up happening is next offseason, whether it's in the draft, whether it's in free agency, the Falcons are going to make a major upgrade at middle linebacker and have Campbell and Jones compete for the open weak side linebacker spot. And it'll be basically the best man win. In between those two guys' competition, the hope is one of those guys will emerge as a long-term option as a starter. And I would agree. I probably will look at Campbell more favorably as a middle linebacker than I would Jones, just because I think he's a little bit more physical. That I think you kind of need to be a little bit more physical at that middle linebacker spot because you're patrolling the A gap a little bit more. But yeah, I mean we'll see how it goes. Like it's going to be that's one of the interesting things about this draft is I think a lot of it is projection, and we could be looking back a year from now or 2 years from now and be like, whoa, that did not go exactly how we thought, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it went poorly. It just might go a completely different way, and we may be talking about, who knows, we may be talking about Devondre Campbell as a stud as opposed to Deion Jones or whatever the case may be. And so we'll just kind of see how it goes. And it's going to be interesting to see how these guys develop over the next couple of years.
And hopefully, best case scenario, those two guys wind up being just badass. Hopefully they end up being like Bobby Wagner, who was a second-round pick, and KJ Wright, who was what round was Wright in, the third or a fourth? Fourth-round pick, who are just long-term starters. And I mean, you can't really do anything. I think it's safe to say those guys aren't going to get their jobs taken anytime soon.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting with Campbell, because I looked it up, and if I were to say Devondre Campbell has Stephen Nicholas upside, probably a lot of people would sit there and say, oh, that's a knock on Devondre Campbell. But, I would tell those people that if you look over the last decade of fourth-round linebackers that have started 50 or more games, Stephen Nicholas is one of, like, 4 guys that have done that. And, that's out of, like, 45 or 50 linebackers that have been drafted in the 4th round over that period of time. So basically, if Devondre Campbell winds up having a career like Stephen Nicholas, where he plays 7 years in the NFL and starts for 3 or 4 of those years, that's a hit. That's a success. That's not a common, like 1 in 8 guys or 1 in 10 guys wind up having careers like that. 4th round picks at linebacker wind up having careers. So that's a definite hit for him. That's sort of where I see him sort of maxing out potentially in terms of his impact, which is a good thing. But I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, he's going to be the superstar or anything like that. He's going to be kind of, I think he's going to, if he does hit, he's going to be a complimentary starter like Stephen Nicholas was, that if you have other playmakers around him, that's a good thing. I think Deion Jones's potential is sort of similar in terms of their impact. Obviously, there's different style players, even though to Stephen Nicholas's credit, he was a lot more athletic than probably people think he was. So
I said Nicholas and Campbell are about the same kind of athlete. Campbell's just a way bigger dude. Like, I think he's taller. I think his frame is bigger. I think he's going to top out at closer to like 245, 250, where Nicholas was more of that 6'3", 230 kind of guy.
Okay, I recall Nicholas being, pushing 6'4" and being about 245 early in his career, but I could be wrong about that.
He was only like, let's just verify this. He was 6'1" and 3/4", 232.
Okay.
At the combine.
He always looked bigger on the field than what I guess he actually was.
Well, that's the thing. Campbell plays bigger than he actually is. And he's a big dude already.
Well, Campbell's interesting because if you had asked me that he's looking at him, and this sort of is what our next question will answer. We'll put a button on Devondre Campbell. Evan Birchfield asked, how much did either of you know about Campbell prior to us drafting him? The fact that he's listed at 6'4", 230 or 235, I wouldn't have guessed that watching him on film. I would have guessed he's more like 6'1", 230. He doesn't look that big on tape. But, measurements are what they are. So I think he kind of has the opposite thing. I would say he looks smaller than what he actually is.
I think they're used in different roles. I think Campbell was used a lot more closer to the line than he probably should have been. And I think once you see him away from the line, you'll see how big he really is. He's a big dude, but he's a really big dude.
Yeah, I can't argue with 6'4", 235. So, all right, let's talk about Austin Hooper. Couple of questions about him from. And before we get into those questions, I will say that I think we might be looking back at this draft many years from now and saying that this was the best pick in this draft. But ATO Sports 404 asks, is Austin Hooper good enough to start and produce right away, or is Jacobs Tammy still the tight end 1?
I think he's good enough to start right away because I think he's a better blocker right away than Tammy is. I mean, I legitimately believe that Austin Hooper is a better blocker than Tammy. But that's because Tammy's an atrocious blocker, and Hooper does just enough to get in the way. That's just the honesty here. Like Hooper is still going to be bad based on NFL standards as a blocker. But is he going to be better than what Tony Gonzalez was? Of course. Is he going to be better than Jacob Tamme? Yeah, as a blocker. As a receiver, I don't see much difference from what a rookie Tamme would bring to the table, or what a rookie Hooper would bring to the table, versus what Tamme brought last year. I'm just being honest here. I think they bring basically the same kind of thing. I think Hooper brings more in contested catches. Tammy's a slightly better route runner, but I mean, they're both basically the same kind of thing. I mean, I really, really like Hooper. The more film that I watch on him, the fact that he goes up over the middle in the red zone and fights with safeties is something that we haven't seen since Tony Gonzalez. Now, will he ever be Tony Gonzalez? Hell no. But he doesn't have to be. Could he be Algie Crumpler Part 2? That's probably more what we're looking at with Austin Hooper. An Algie Crumpler with more contested catches. And I would take that in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the upper end of sort of Hooper's upside. I like Hooper. I think he's really good in traffic. Do I think he'll start over Tamme week 1? No, but maybe by the time we get to later in the season, yeah, I think there's probably a good chance that he'll be getting more snaps than Tamme if he sort of plays at the level that he's capable of. Tight end position is traditionally a position that guys don't immediately hit the ground running in the NFL just because there's a whole lot of stuff you have to do. It's not a simple where you can just put an athlete out there and let him run around and catch footballs. So I think ideally the Falcons are probably going to try to not redshirt Hooper, but basically get him a year of development before they sort of throw him to the wolves as a starter. And having a veteran like Jacob Tamme there as a decent starter to rely upon. So I would say Hooper will start games this year. Frankly, Levine Toilolo started 15 games last year. People don't realize that because, on first down, on that first snap of the game, the Falcons want to have a blocking tight end out there because of how much the team runs the football. But he didn't play nearly as much as Tamme did. I think Tamme played about 250 more snaps over the course of the season than Toilolo did. So I think Hooper's probably destined for the same role that Toilolo did. He'll start games. He'll probably wind up starting like 12 or 13 games, but he'll probably wind up only playing about 500, 600 snaps this year. I think his big impact is going to be in the red zone as opposed to being a true blue every down starter. Okay. So next question about Hooper is from Emmanuel Scott. He says, looking at the schedule, what game will be Hooper's best in his rookie season and what he goes for? Obviously, Emmanuel is looking for some fantasy advice that he can take advantage of in this fall. So I guess we'll do the best that we can do, giving you fantasy advice at the beginning of May.
So if I had to pick a game, I'd pick one towards the middle/end of the year. I pick one with a team that doesn't have great coverage linebackers as it is. One that their strong side linebacker has a bit of an injury history. And one who just doesn't really seem to match up well with the Falcons. And that team would be the Buccaneers. That second Buccaneers game, I think, would be, if there's a Hooper coming out party this year, I think it's that year. It's that game because Santana's good, Quan Alexander's solid, but I don't think that they've got a guy who can really man up with Hooper. And McDougald is garbage, and Keith Tandy's awful. And I think if you have Hooper going straight up against Tandy, it's done. I think if Josh Robinson's covering him in the slot, it's done because the thing he gets away with is contested catches. And Tandy is all of 5'10". Robinson is, I want to say, 5'11". He's 5'10". I mean, even Hargreaves and Grimes are only 5'10". Like, that entire secondary is full of 5'10". Their tallest guy is Brad McDougal, who's 6 foot. He's just got the length to go up and get those contested catches. And I think you could see a game where, you know, Hooper's just running these 15-yard hooks, these 10-yard slants, these 5 and 6 yard in and out routes, and he's just going up and in, up and out, up and in, up and out. And it may not be, you know, the easiest. He may not have the prettiest routes, but he'll create enough separation to where Ryan says, well, he's open even though he's got one-on-one, because I know he's going to go up there and get the ball if I put it high.
Okay. I'm looking at like Football Outsiders, and I'm looking at their sort of metrics on who's the best or who's the worst covering tight ends last year, and looking at our schedule. And I think the Saints, the 49ers, and the Raiders were the worst, at least last season, at covering tight ends based off of their DVOA metrics. I wouldn't look at the 49ers or the Raiders as sort of teams that I would imagine being poor against the tight end because of players like Malcolm Smith and Navarro Bowman. And I guess the Saints, now that, you know, what they've shuffled with their linebacker core this offseason, I would probably, you know, if I'm giving you fantasy advice of when Austin Hooper's going to have his breakout game, you know, maybe that Week 17 game against the Saints, the final game of the year, you know, maybe we can give the Saints a little taste of what Jimmy Graham gave us early in his career. So that would probably be, you know, how much yards, I don't know, 80 yards, let's say that, and a touchdown. Okay, so let's talk about the Falcons' late round picks, and no one asked the real question about Wes Schweitzer. I guess we can get to one question that does sort of deal about Schweitzer. Charlie Rogers asks, I see 4 potential starters by midseason from this class. What are the chances that Schweitzer makes it 5?
I think Schweitzer's going to be a dark horse to start at left guard this year. And I know Aaron's going to say that I'm talking crazy, but all the best, like the truly best left guards in the NFL, they played left tackle in college. They learned how to handle pretty much any kind of pass rusher in college. And then when they got to the pros, it was really just add strength, add weight, and you're golden. I mean, when you look and see some of these guys, you know, just I'm looking here, like Clint Bowling, he played right tackle, but he was a tackle. Joel Bitonio, he played left tackle. Let's see. I'm just trying to find, like, the best of the best. Kelechi Osemele, he played left tackle in college. Orlando Franklin played left tackle in college. La'el Collins played left tackle in college. Justin Pugh played left tackle in college. Cody Whitehair played left tackle in college. Laken Tomlinson played left tackle in college. I'm just going down the list. Sitton played left tackle in college. I mean, just going down, you see all these different guys. You're like, holy cow, how many left tackles are there? Mikey Upati even played left tackle in college. Roger Saffold played left tackle in college. I mean, even Justin Britt played left tackle in college. He was awful at it. He played left tackle in college.
And you played left tackle in college.
Yeah, I don't even remember Levitri, but even then, it's awesome. Like, that's how you know the guy can pass block as a left guard, is based on his left tackle experience. Just so many, Clint Bowling so many different guys played left tackle in college because the skills are transferable on that side. Left tackle and left guard both are going to see a lot of one-on-one pass protection situations. They're going to see 3 techs lined up over the same way a defensive end would have lined up over them at left tackle. Quite often, especially in the NFL. One-on-one, quite often, the same way they did in college. So when you look at left guards, you find guys who succeeded at left tackle, you put them there. I think Levitri could slide over to right guard. I think if you had a right guard fight between basically Levitri and Chester and who else is over there? Levitri, Chester, Person, Stone. Whoever wins on the right side is going to be. I feel like at this point you could have J.R. Sweezy over there and be okay. And Aaron knows my view on Sweezy.
Yeah, I do know. I've heard some things.
Garbage. But yeah, you could have J.R. Sweezy over there, be okay. I just think that when you have the combination of intelligence and quickness and strength that Schweitzer has as a guard, I think he'll be fine. One thing Aaron pointed out to me before the show was that he was like, well, I don't know if he can really handle a bull rush as a guard. But when you go and you watch his tape against Auburn, which was the best competition San Jose State played all year, he handled Carl Lawson all day long with his bull rush. So I don't understand, I really don't understand why he wouldn't be able to. Now, I do think he would have trouble with some of the better guys out there his rookie season. I do think Kawan Short would be tough. I definitely think Gerald McCoy would be tough. Sheldon Rankins might give him some fits. But when you look outside of the division, there's not a lot of great 3-techs in the NFL today, outside of, say, Aaron Donald and the Rams and Ndamukong Suh with the Dolphins.
Okay. Yeah, he's going to have to block like Gerald McCoy and Fletcher Cox this year if he's a starter. So I think he's going to struggle. Do I think Schweitzer has the potential to start by midseason? Surprise, surprise. I'm going to say no. I think Schweitzer's upside, if you're a fan of Schweitzer, and I do like aspects of his game. I do think he's got pretty good technique. I think the thing he's going to have to work on is his punch is going to he's got to be more violent with his punch, because there was too often in the one game I've seen so far from he was easing into his punches, and you just can't do that in the NFL as a starting offensive guard and play at a competent level. That was the big issue with Peter Kahns. He just kind of eased into his blocks, and we all know how that worked out. I think with Schweitzer, I think his upside, what his potential is to be a Garrett Reynolds type of player, which is a guy who's a quality backup that in an emergency you can start him, is less than ideal as a 16-game starter. But, Garrett Reynolds is a bad word among Falcon fans, but if we're being honest, other than that one season of John Asamoah, Garrett Reynolds at his peak performance was not terrible as a starting right guard for the Falcons relative to some of the offensive linemen we fielded the last couple of years. I don't see Schweitzer being in – I think basically what Schweitzer's going to be is he's either going to be a practice squad guy, or maybe the other – he might unseat James Stone or Ben Garland as the other interior guy behind Person as like the 8th guy in the rotation. But I don't expect much from him as a rookie. I don't really expect a ton from him long term. I think he could be a good backup. I think he's a good player, but I think there's a reason why he was a 6th-round pick that no one had heard of when we drafted him. Not because he's bad, but I think we probably have to put a firm cap on where we think his ceiling is. Could I wind up being wrong? Absolutely, but I think if we were to play out this scenario 100 times, 99 times out of 100, he'll be a backup in the NFL. A good backup, maybe, certainly possible, but probably a backup.
I'm going to say this. When you're wrong, good things happen. And in this situation, I think you're wrong. I think a lot of draft people, a lot of drafts, Twitter, I guess you could say, a lot of the draft people who, what's the word? A lot of the Mel Kiper Juniors and such just missed and didn't really watch this guy that much. Myself included. I saw one game and was like, eh. And it was against Oregon State. I just kind of wrote him off. I was like, yeah, this guy's whatever. I'm not even throwing him on my watch list. So sometimes we screw up because, yeah.
Okay. All right, let's talk about Devin Fuller. Okay, a lot of people have questions about what Fuller potentially replacing Devin Hester. Evan Birchfield asked, does drafting Fuller affect Hester and or Weems making the team? And ATL Sports 404 says, could Devin Hester still be cut and could he still produce in 2016?
If he's healthy, he's worth it. If he's healthy, I think he could produce. I think he could be the same guy that he was at least in 2014. If he's not healthy, I think Devin Fuller's the guy. I think you cut Hester. I think you take that $3 million next offseason and the money you get back from Paul Soliai, the extra $5 million from Paul Soliai, that $8 million, and you add it towards next season's cap. And you just kind of look at it and you go, you know what? We got all this extra cap. We've got $8 million that we can add on 2017. We can throw that extra $8 million, have $58, $59 million in cap space, re-sign a few guys like Robert Alford. Let's see who's a free agent. Robert Alford will be a free agent. Tammy will be a free agent. Schrader will be a free agent. Other than that, there's not really anybody that's like go out and make sure you keep them next year. So I know a lot of people are saying, you know, hey, Robert Alford's not coming back. It's pointless to even worry about it. But the Falcons have the money to keep him. And I know Aaron's one of those guys that says, hey, you can't spend all that money on two corners. You can't give these guys $75 million and $40 million. It's not worth it. It's not. Screw that. All right? There's 5 key positions in the NFL. Quarterback, defensive end / pass rusher, left tackle and right tackle. So your offensive tackles, your defensive end, your quarterback, your wide receivers, and your corners. Those are your key spots because they all affect the quarterback. Anything outside of those is not as important. And when you've got $58 million in cap space, like the Falcons will next year, is because the roster isn't amazing. And as Aaron says, when the roster's not amazing, it's because the talent's not there. So why would you let a talented guy walk because you're worried about cap space when you've got an abundance of it, especially in the future? So at that point, I think they end up re-signing him. I think they'd be stupid not to re-sign him when you look at the cap situation. And then you don't really have to worry too much about what's going on with Jalen Collins either. And as they say in the NFL, you need at least 3 good cornerbacks because teams are going to throw out 3 good receivers. When you've got Alford and Trufant and Collins as your top 3 corners, and Neal back there as your strong safety, what's the position that you really need at that point?
Okay. You know, can the Falcons afford to pay Robert Alford and keep both True and Alford? Yeah, they can. Will they, you know, my whole thing is, will they do it? No, they're not, because they're not going to pay $100 million. They're not going to devote $100 million in contracts to cornerbacks. It's just, they're not going to do it. It's just, that's not the way they're going to handle their business. They're going to give Trufant his $70 million contract, and unless Robert Alford's going to be willing to pay for a really extreme hometown discount for playing for under $30 million, which he should be able to get in his sleep on the open market, it's not going to happen. But, you know, specifically on these questions, I do think Hester is going to get cut. I do think Eric Weems is going to get cut. The Falcons can basically free up about $4 million in cap space this year by cutting both of those guys. And I think Fuller really was basically their insurance. Now, if Hester comes back healthy and is the old Devin Hester, you know, at age 35 and comes in the preseason takes 2 kicks to the house in the preseason games, then he's going to keep his job. If Eric Weems at his age is going out there and getting like 10 special teams tackles on preseason games, then he might be able to keep his job. But I do think the Falcons, Justin Hardy played pretty well on special teams coverage last year. Having Mohamed Sanu now on the roster means that the Falcons can afford to put Hardy on special teams this year because Hardy's is technically a starter as the number 3 receiver, but not to the degree where he can't perform on special teams coverage and replace Weems' role there. And I think Fuller basically gives them an option to replace Devin Hester with about $6 million in cap space. I think the Falcons have right now, and then $5 million of that's going to go away once they sign the rookies. That $4 million in cap space that the Falcons can gain by cutting Hester and Weems at the end of training camp, assuming that they're replacing them with Hardy, and they're going from a 34, 35-year-old in Hester and a 30 or 31-year-old Weems to 2 guys that are going to be 22-ish. It's kind of a no-brainer decision. So basically, Devin Hester's hope is that he balls out this summer, and Devin Fuller sucks this summer. And I think if that doesn't happen, then it's inevitable that he's going to get cut. But the Falcons will say for the next couple of months, "Oh no, Devin Hester's safe. He's going to keep his job," and we'll come. We'll find out that first week of September that that's not true. So,
to be fair, the Falcons cap situation, Soliai comes off. $5.4 million of Soliai's money comes off. Rookies are only supposed to cost about $4 million. So if they've got 6, they've got really about $7.5 million in cap space, roughly, right now. So if they cut Hester, that's about $10 million in cap space. 10, 11. If they cut Hester and if they cut Hester and Weems.
Math is not my strong suit. So yeah, you're right. But I think that $4 million is going to be too enticing for them. It's basically the difference between carrying however much 7 into the season or 11 into the season, and obviously everybody knows that whatever you don't use this year carries over to next year. So then again, if you're in we're going to keep both Robert Alford, then that $4 million that you can save in September by cutting Hester and Weems potentially carries over to next year, and now all of a sudden you're talking about $60 million in cap space or whatever the number is. As for Devin Fuller himself, I do expect his impact to be special teams. I do think he can do some things on offense, but I see him more as a wide receiver 4 type of player. Long term, he'll make some plays, but I don't think he's ever going to be the type of receiver that you're going to be able to rely upon to be more than that. So, I think he's the type of guy that, maybe his peak production any given year is going to be like 30 catches for 400 yards and maybe 2 or 3 touchdowns or something like that, which is fine for a number 4 receiver.
For a 7th round pick, that's great too. Like the fact that he would make the roster and be a special teamer alone, like that's a great 7th round pick if he's a long-term returner. So, I mean, don't have super high expectations of this guy. Like maybe he has like an 80-yard catch every other year, and like that's his contribution to the offense. But I mean, that alone would be worth it.
Yeah. Okay, so we got pretty much. I hope we answered both of you guys' questions on the Falcons draft picks in particular. We got a couple of other questions, more general draft stuff. Let's jump into that. We got 2 questions about players that the Falcons potentially missed. Broseph929 says, "What are some of the players we missed on, not named Miles Jack?" And Ryan O'Brien says, "Tell me a few guys you personally would have taken that were still on the board when the Falcons were picking. I think Billings to replace Soliai was a no-brainer in route code."
I don't disagree there, but the Falcons didn't have the 5th round pick, so I think that's why they didn't do it. In the 1st round, I would have gone with Shaq Lawson and Miles Jack. In the second round, I honestly like Sue Cravens a little bit more than Deion Jones, but that's one of those 6 and 1, half dozen in the other. You either like take a guy you like more or not. In the third round, I mean, Austin Hooper at that point was one of my highest rated players. So, honestly, I wouldn't have taken anybody above him. I thought he was the best fit right there. Like, that was the best pick they made all draft. In the fourth round, Andrew Billings, that's definitely a name that people are going to look at and say, why didn't we take him? But even past that, I mean, Dean Lowry's going to look like a steal in a couple of years. You can make the argument that Connor McGovern was still on the board, and he would have been a great fit for the offense. He probably would have started at a guard spot. Kentrell Brothers, a lot of people liked him in the process leading up. I don't understand why he went as lead as he did. Christian Westerman, that's a name that a lot of fans kept tweeting at me like, hey, why is this guy still on the board? I didn't think he was super great, but, I mean, he went way later than I was expecting. Over Wes Schweitzer at the back end of the draft, I mean, they could have gone Kyle Murphy out of Stanford. They could have gone Joey Hunt out of Texas Christian. Donovan Clark, Ted Carrot. I mean, there's a whole stack of guys. Nadal Alexander is the one that they should have gone with, though. Despite his fit in the scheme, like, he's just a ridiculous player. Devin Fuller's fast as hell, but Kenny Waller was on the board. He's not as fast, but he's just a better receiver. And if they're really worried about kick returns, I don't understand why they didn't just go after Keith Marshall out of Georgia. Get the hometown guy, upgrade your third-string running back, kill 2 birds with 1 stone. He'll be a long-term gunner. I think you see a role for him like Anton Smith. You just throw him out there and hope that his speed takes over. I mean, I honestly, that was the one pick where I was like, I think you could sign Fuller, and then you should have drafted Marshall. And then people are going to bring up Jaron Curse. But guys, Jaron Curse blows. He legitimately has no idea what the hell he's doing out there in coverage, and he's not physical enough to play linebacker. So I'm glad the Falcons didn't get him.
Okay. I'm not a big fan of the we should have taken this guy. I just think that's kind of a waste. But because you guys asked the question, I'll answer it. Obviously, in round 1, if I can't pick Miles Jack, then I'll go with Shaq Lawson. Round 2, I'd probably say Cody Whitehair. Round 3, maybe Justin Simmons or Anthony Hargrove, even though I sort of agree with Scott that I think Hooper is probably the best guy at that point. Round 4, maybe Joe Dahl or Joe Haig or somebody like that. But, ultimately it doesn't really matter who doesn't matter who the Falcons passed on. It's about who they got. And you can't sit there and be like, we should have gotten this guy and we should have got, that's not – there's no point in doing that, personally, I sort of feel. But, there's always going to be, unless you pick Tom Brady or unless you picked J.J. Watt, there's always going to be a better draft pick. So that's how I feel about it.
And even Tom Brady at the time was considered a bad draft pick.
In some circles, yeah.
Yeah, like he was considered undraftable by a lot of people based on his on-field play.
Okay, we got a couple questions about our favorite pick. Falc Lover 69, Broseph 929, Bruce, Big Boy Brewski. So basically, everybody's asking who's our favorite pick and who's our least favorite pick. So, Scott, who's your favorite pick and who's your least favorite pick?
My favorite pick is gotta be Austin Hooper. The more I watch of him, the more I go back and watch of him, the more I'm just like, this guy can start and give the Falcons a guy in the middle of the offense that just kills it. And that's what they need. I mean, that's really just what they need. I mean, someone who can stretch the middle of the defense. And I think Hooper's got it. I think he's the guy that can do it. I think long term, you might see a guy who's closer to a Jason Witten, Algie Crumpler type than anything else. Ideally, my least favorite pick, I'm going to let you guys know I like Devin Fuller, but I thought he was undraftable. They should have just taken. They legitimately should have just taken Keith Marshall there. Like, I would have been much happier had I seen Keith Marshall come off the board, stay in Atlanta, and just be a Falcon. Because I think between Marshall and Freeman and Coleman, you got a really young, really fast, really good all-around receiving core. Or not receiving core, rushing core. And from there, you can sign Fuller after the draft.
My favorite pick is Austin Hooper. I do feel like, you guys know I haven't been the biggest fan of the Falcons all season, but I do feel like Hooper is one of the few guys that we've added this offseason that brings something significantly to the table that we didn't have on the roster last year. I think a lot of our other signings are kind of just rehashes of guys that we already have or slight upgrades over guys that we already had. But, I think Hooper's ability to win in the red zone, his ability to win in traffic is a skill set that we didn't have last year. Or maybe we had it in Levine Toilolo, but we didn't play him enough to really discover that. So that's my favorite pick. My least favorite pick, I said it earlier, I think it's Deion Jones. I don't think Deion Jones is a bad player, but I do think based off of where he got drafted and now because he's going to be a middle linebacker and everybody's like, oh, man, he's going to be an upgrade. I think the expectations on what he's going to be in Atlanta are a lot higher than I think probably his ability merits. I always saw Deion Jones all along as like a late third, fourth round talent. And we took him in the top 50, where you're guys that are basically when you're drafting the top 50, you're looking for guys with Pro Bowl potential. I don't think Deion Jones has that. I think he could have a long, successful career in Atlanta, but I think it's going to be more as that sort of Stephen Nicholas type of player than sort of what, Sean Weatherspoon was at his peak, back in 2011 when he was arguably the best 4-3 linebacker, outside linebacker in the NFL. I don't see that sort of upside with Deion Jones when you're picking in the top 50. That's the type of player that you want to try to get. And I just kind of look at it and I'm like I think the gap between Deion Jones and Devondre Campbell, I think is very small in terms of their ability. And I think where we drafted Campbell is really about where in a perfect ideal world, we probably should have drafted Deion Jones, but he'll wind up he'll wind up playing in Atlanta for like 8 or 9 years, and we'll see how it goes. But it's probably my least favorite pick. Okay, now we can get to an interesting question because we didn't answer it before, but a bunch of people asked a question about Arthur Blank saying he wanted 4 starters. And these questions come from ATL Sports 404, Evan Birchfield, and Charlie Rogers. Basically, everybody's asking us, did the Falcons get 4 starters?
I think they got 3. And I think he wanted 3 out of the first 4 picks. And honestly, Deion Jones is going to be a starter. Whether it's weak side or Mike, I think he's going to be a starter regardless. I think Quinn wants that speed on the field. I think he needs it in coverage. And I don't see a way Wheeler or Weatherspoon or Reed or Warlow would start over Jones, or even Campbell would start over Jones. I think Jones was selected to be that starter. Obviously, Keanu Neal is going to be a starter because he just is miles above what Kamal Ishmael is. And I'm a huge Kamal Ishmael fan. I love Kamal Ishmael. But as a starter in this defense, hell no. Not over Keanu Neal. And I think at tight end, I think Austin Hooper is the starter. I think Hooper starts over Tammy because he's a better blocker. And I think he's about the same as a receiver. Now, I think between Hooper and Tammy, you've got 2 guys that are going to play about 50-50 in the snaps. I think both guys see about 500, 550 snaps. And I think you're going to see a good overlap where you're going to have 2 tight ends on the field at times. Or quite often, honestly. I think between Tammy, Hooper, and DeMarco, You've got three guys in there in that tight end, fullback, H-back role that Shanahan's going to like because Shanahan loves that role. And then when you've got Jones and some new and, you don't really have the number 3, number 4 wide receivers that make you say, hey, we got to run a ton of 3 and 4 wide receiver sets. I like Justin Hardy, but I don't think the Falcons run 3 and 4 wide receiver sets nearly as much as they have in the past. And I think it makes them a lot more balanced by doing that, by having those underneath options. So when you can line up in an ace, which is a 21 or not 21. Yeah, 21 personnel, where it's 2 tight ends, 1 running back. And you've got that ace. I may be getting it wrong. I play defense. I don't really know offensive packages. I know 11 is 3 wide receiver. I know 22 is 2 tight end, 2 running back. I don't really care from the defensive side of things, the difference between a 12 and a 21, it's the same thing. You need 3 linebackers versus 3 combo guys. So that's the same thing to me. But when you've got Tammy and Hooper and DeMarco all in there just rotating out, staying fresh, and you've got that fresh combo guy in the middle, it makes it even more fun. You've got those guys who can make plays underneath, over the seam, in the flats. And that's not even including Devontae Freeman or Tevin Coleman out of the backfield.
Okay. No, to answer the question, guys, did the Falcons get 4 starters? No. I mean, I guess technically it depends on how you're defining starters. Are you talking about guys that start games? Then, yeah, they probably did get 4 guys that will start games for the Falcons over the next couple of years. If we're talking about guys that we're going to look back 4 or 5 years from now and be like, oh, yeah, these guys are definite starters and they are entrenched as starters, the answer is no. I mean, it's one of those things where, and this is where, I get the label of being negative all the time, but it's like, I actually do research on this stuff. And so, the research I've discovered says that 22.6% of guys that get drafted are starters. So it's basically 1 out of every 5. And you look at that 2011, 2012 draft where the Seattle Seahawks drafted better than any other team over that 2-year period and really built their Super Bowl team over the next 2 years. And they had 19 picks those 2 years, and they got 8 starters. And, one of those starters, it includes J.R. Sweezy, which is Scott's boy. So maybe Scott would say they only really got 7 starters and just a guy who's a body. But, 8 out of 19 picks is like a 42% hit rate, and that's the best. That's elite drafting. That's what that would be considered, and that's 3 out of 7. So if you're basically saying that the Falcons got out of this year's draft class, got 3 starters, that's basically saying that this is as good a draft class as any we've seen in the last 6 or 7 years. And I think that's a little rich. And if you're going to say that we got 4 starters, you're basically saying that that's, this is one of the greatest draft classes in NFL history. And I just don't think that's realistic. And when you come in and you say they only got 2 starters, which is a 33% hit rate, which is 50% better than the NFL average, that's deemed being negative or something like that. But that's really being optimistic. If the Falcons got 2 starters out of this draft, that's a good draft. That's what's called a good draft. 2 out of 6 is a good draft. And I feel like the Falcons probably did that with Neal and Hooper. I don't really think I think Jones and Campbell will start games, but I think ultimately when we get, 3-4 years down the road and these guys are up to second contracts, I think probably by then the Falcons probably will have found better players than what those guys are. Or at least I kind of hope.
Then Hooper?
No, I'm talking the linebackers.
Oh, okay. Jones and Campbell?
Yeah.
I think Jones is a long-term starter. I think that's the plan for him, and I think he'll grow and mature into that. When you watch him, you in context realize he had just 1 year starting. I mean, it does help out a little bit. But just to go against your point here, because that's what I'm going to do.
Okay.
The Buffalo Bills in 2011 wound up with 5 starters from one draft. Marcel Darius, Aaron Williams, Calvin Shepard, Norris Searcy, and Chris Hairston. 5 picks in the first 4 rounds wound up starting for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm talking about. Like, Hairston started games, but he was bad, and they cut him after 3 years. Shepard started games, but he was bad, and they traded him after 2 or 3 years. So like, you can, if you want to say that we will drafted 4 guys that will start games, yeah, I can agree with that. But if you're talking about guys that will start games and play at a high enough level that they will remain starters with the Falcons long term, which does not describe Chris Hairston, does not describe Kelvin Shepard. I think that's a pipe dream. That's what I think. So, I mean, it depends on what your definition of starting. If a guy like, is J.R. Sweezy a starter? Clearly, Scott, you think he's one of the worst players in the NFL and has no business being a starter. A lot of people think.
However, I'd say that he is a starter.
Okay. I mean, a lot of people think Paul Warlow has no business starting games, but he is a starter.
He is a starter. Yeah. He's a guy who starts and plays. If you start and you play over 600 snaps, now, we're not saying no one ever said, like, in Blank's thing, he never said they have to be Pro Bowlers. He just assumes, I'm assuming he needs at least an average starter or someone who fits the scheme and does well. If you look at the Broncos, that 2011 draft for the Broncos, they had Von Miller, Raheem Moore, Orlando Franklin, Julius Thomas, and Virgil Green. That's 5 starters out of 9 picks. I mean, maybe I'm just cherry picking because it's the 11th draft, the 2011 draft. But again, I'm just looking here and looking at the percentage. You can get starters all throughout the draft. And some of these teams, they didn't get starters in certain further drafts, but it wasn't because of not drafting the right talent. It was because the players themselves got injured. If you look at the Chiefs 11 draft, John Baldwin, Rodney Hudson, Justin Houston, Alan Bailey, I mean, even Jarrell Poe all started for them. That's 4 or 5 starters out of 8 picks.
Okay. I mean, Jonathan Baldwin is considered one of the biggest draft busts in the last 5 years. Virgil Green
still started 2 years.
22 games in his NFL career. So, I mean, like, again, yeah, if you're going to basically say, well, you start games, that makes you a starter, and all starters, and basically, that's what I'm saying. Like, if you're going to sit there and say, if you consider Paul Warlow a starter where everybody universally says anybody but Warlow as a starter this year, and you're like, well, but that's a starter, that's a hit, like, that to me is sort of this.
Where he was drafted, that was definitely a hit because he wasn't drafted.
Okay. I mean, I think, yeah, relative to most undrafted free agents where 90% of those guys don't even stick on the NFL roster, Paul Warlow is a hit. But if you're going to sit there and tell me that Paul Warlow adds value to the Falcons roster beyond being basically a glorified special teams player, then I'm going to say no. And I think ultimately that's how you build your team. You don't build your team with a bunch of Chris Harrisons and a bunch of Virgil Greens or a bunch of John Baldwins. You build your team with Von Millers and those type of players that actually have impact on your roster. Because if you're a team, NFL team, and you're starting Chris Hairston, or take another Falcon example, Lamar Holmes or Peter Kunz, both those guys were technically starters for the Falcons. But if they were penciled into the starting lineup right now, people would be pulling their hair out being like, we have to get a better player. We have to get a better player. And if you're in the mindset of we need to upgrade this player, then I don't consider that guy to be a true blue starter, because if he was, you wouldn't be worried about getting a better starter in his place. You're basically saying he's a backup, but because we don't have a better player right now, he starts for us. So, I mean, that's basically like, I think 2 guys are starters. I think Neal and Hooper have got the best chance. I think between Jones and Campbell, I think you might get one guy that is a functional Stephen Nicholas caliber starter who, you can live with as a starter, but you're not going to sit here and say, man, our defense is awesome because Stephen Nicholas is starting for us. It's just be like, he does his job. I think that's what Jones and Campbell's potentials are. And I think between the 2 of them, one of them has a good chance of becoming that type of player. But if you're going to sit there and say, both of those guys or any other guys are going to be guys that we're going to count on and look at as fixtures on our defense that we're not going to be, because think about Stephen Nicholas. For many, many years, people were looking at him as a guy that we could upgrade that position at. That's why they drafted Akeem Dent. That's why, people were ready to plug Joplo Bartu into the starting lineup his rookie year, because it's like, well, we kind of know what Stephen Nicholas is at this point and we can get better. And I think that's kind of where Jones and or Campbell's futures is headed, which is not a bad pick. Again, I mentioned Stephen Nicholas is one of the most successful, fourth-round linebackers. Stephen Tulloch and maybe KJ Wright are the only other guys out there that have had better careers than Stephen Nicholas over the last decade as fourth-round picks. So if that's what Campbell or Jones is, that's not a bad thing. But if you're gonna, I've said enough. But yeah. So the next question is from Broseph929. He says, "Who will have the best rookie season?"
As much as I like Keanu Neal, I still think Hooper is that guy. I think Hooper's going to play a lot more than Aaron does. Again, Aaron's sitting here like, yeah, tight ends don't do this, tight ends don't do that. Well, Travis Kelce did, but let's ignore him.
Travis Kelce basically
got dropped into the same kind of situation where it was a journeyman, and he was an instant starter because there was a journeyman in front of him.
He played like 3 games as a rookie.
Oh, that's right. He was injured, but he was scheduled to start because that 2013 Chiefs roster was pretty shitty.
They had like Anthony Fasano. I don't think he would have started, but sure.
He would have started over Fasano.
Probably not.
He had won the job in preseason and then got injured like the very next week.
I don't think that's true, but okay. I think it was the 3rd string tight end, and that's what he was going to be. But
Fasano and Sean McGrath.
Look, I'm not arguing whether Kelce was a better player than those guys, but the idea that he was penciled in as the starter week 1 over those guys, and the only thing that stopped him from being that was an injury, I don't think it's true. But that's all I'm saying. But to answer Joseph's question, I think it's Keanu Neal. I think he's going to play the most out of all these rookies, barring injury. So I think by default he will have, he has the best chance at least to have the best rookie season because he'll wind up playing the most. So, yeah. Next question is from Evan Birchfield. He says, "What do you think we'll say about this draft 5 years from now?"
I think we'll say Aaron was wrong.
Okay.
That the first 3 picks were all starters. Like legit starters too.
Okay.
That Aaron was right about Campbell. Stephen Nicholas, KJ Wright, same kind of guy, if we're being honest here. I wouldn't consider KJ Wright this great, starting weak side linebacker, but he's average.
Yeah.
I think Stephen Nicholas was the same kind of guy. So, I mean, if Devondre Campbell is Stephen Nicholas or KJ Wright, that's a win for a 4th-round pick.
I agree.
I think Schweitzer is going to surprise people. And I think Fuller's not going to make the roster after this year. Just being honest with you. I even as a returner, I don't see what's so great about Fuller. I think they can find someone who's a better returner pretty quickly next year when they got their full slate of 7 picks.
Okay. I think 5 years from now we'll look back at this draft, and a lot of people that are really hyping up this draft, I think will wind up being wrong. Like it usually plays out. The draft isn't as sort of this tsunami of talent acquisition that or at least in the individual draft, is not sort of this tsunami of talent acquisition that people like to pretend it is. Basically, best case scenario for the Falcons, I think, is all six of these guys are still on the Falcons, which is probably unlikely since 45% of guys that get drafted are not in the league 5 years from now. So I think probably in all likelihood, if the Falcons get 2 starters, 2 role players, and 2 guys wash out of the league, that's probably what we'll say about this draft. And if those 2 starters, probably I would put my money on Keanu Neal and Austin Hooper are considered, blue chip or red chip players, top 10, top 15 players at their positions, which I think both those guys have the potential to be, then I think we'll look at this draft favorably. But I do think in terms of sort of what we see, I don't think we're going to look back 5 years from now and say, oh, man, this was a great draft. Like we look back at the 08 draft, or we look back at I would say 2015 probably has a better chance of living up to that potential. But I do feel like this is a draft that we'll look back and we got some solid pieces in this draft. It was all part of, that 3 to 5 year process that Dan Quinn brought to Atlanta, that this was just one stepping stone in multiple stepping stones where the Falcons were able to fulfill, hopefully they were able to get a difference maker in their defense in the secondary with Keanu Neal. Hopefully they finally stopped the bleeding at tight end by getting Austin Hooper. Hopefully we look back and we say, even though maybe Campbell and Jones weren't the superstars that I think some people are hyping them up to be, we got production from them over their rookie contracts. Maybe both of those guys start 30, 40 games and are decent, Stephen Nicholas caliber players. And we look at them as like, okay, they may not be the world's greatest linebackers, but they're decent. We're not losing any sleep over those guys playing for us. Maybe Fuller has a couple of good years as a return specialist, and Schweitzer adds depth and has a Garrett Reynolds type of career where, not being forced into the lineup like the Falcons tried to do with Garrett Reynolds for 3 years, but, come in and you look at Garrett Reynolds' career elsewhere in St. Louis and Detroit, he's been a quality backup that has played snaps and started games the last couple of years and been functional coming off the bench, and I think that's sort of Schweitzer's potential, and I think that's sort of in my vision, that's the best case scenario for this draft 5 years from now. Or we could look at it worst case, and we got one decent starter and everybody else was bad, and we look at it similar, like we've looked at a lot of Thomas Dimitroff drafts between 09 and 2012, and that's possible. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's always possible. All right, let's get into more mailbag questions, guys. Cookie by Nature asks, if Spoon is completely healthy, do you see him starting at weak side linebacker?
No, I just don't see him because he's not going to be completely healthy. It's just not how it works. Like, Spoon is just not. His knee's shredded. Like, he's done. And not to say his ankle shredded. If he can look like 90% of what he was, maybe. But even then, I don't really know if he starts.
Okay. Yeah, in this, if you're talking, he's more the Spoon of what he was prior to the Achilles, and now what is he 2 years off the Achilles, and that's usually the time where guys come reasonably back to what they were before. Then yeah, I think he's the starter. But is that, as Sky says, is it likely that he's going to be what he once was? Probably not. Is it likely that he's going to be able to, even if he starts week 1, is he going to start 16 games? Probably not. And I think that's probably going to be the opportunity that either Jones or Campbell take advantage of and get reps this year, and maybe they shine in that role, and we'll see how it goes. But I do think Spoon is a top. I think it's his job to lose, and I think the main thing that will stop him from winning that job is injury. So yeah. Big Boy Brewski asks, who will be the starters at all linebacker positions?
Strong side linebacker, Vic Beasley. Weak side linebacker, when all said and done, I think it's Deion Jones. Middle linebacker, when all said and done this year, I could see Sean Weatherspoon in that role. I think in the future, I think it's definitely going to be Deion Jones in the middle. Once he gains some weight, gets a little stronger, and then Campbell's going to play weak side linebacker.
Okay. Yeah. I think probably week one, your best case is the same guys that you thought were going to start before the draft. I think it's Breed, Warlow, and Spoon. But I do think there's a pretty good possibility that by the time we get to week 17, it could be Beasley, Jones, and Campbell. Just because I think there's a decent possibility the Falcons aren't a playoff team and they reach a point, that last month or so of the season where they're like, oh, we're not really in the playoff hunt. Let's give these young guys an opportunity to see what they do, because we know Warlow, Spoon, and Wheeler and Reed aren't going to be Falcons in 2017. So let's go with these guys. Or maybe those guys play well enough early in the season that they take their jobs. What the starting lineup is week one, I think probably there's a good chance it won't be that by the time we reach the end of the season. Okay, Falcons ATP is hashtag anybody but World, why we are accepting of a middle linebacker who is mediocre in coverage and poor in tackling. I'm assuming he's talking about Deion Jones.
Deion Jones is way better in coverage than you think he is. Yeah, he's actually really good in coverage for the kind of coverage the Falcons run. He's not great in man, but he's really, really good in zone. He covers what he's supposed to cover. He understands how to switch. Charles, over at the Falcoholic, wrote something up about it, and when you read it, you really understand what I'm talking about. He's great when it comes to zone coverage. I'm okay with having a middle linebacker in a zone-based scheme that's great in zone coverage and has issues covering man.
Yeah, I mean, I do think people desperately wanting an upgrade of a Warlow, I think, is causing people to pump Deion Jones up slightly. But, even though I'm not as high on Deion Jones as it seems the rest of the world, I'm probably not as low as him as Falcons ATP seems to be. So, we'll see how it goes. But I do sort of think I think one of the reasons why people are praising this draft is because everybody's so desperate for the Falcons to make upgrades at linebacker that pretty much anybody they would have drafted that played linebacker, people would have said positive things about them and been very optimistic about their potential to impact this year, just because of basically the Falcons have had the worst linebacker core in the NFL the last 2 years. So basically anybody that's fast and or physical, is going to be seen as really good. We got two Grady Jarrett questions from Jelani234 and Charlie Rogers 68. Basically, what are our thoughts on Grady Jarrett playing nose tackle?
I'm perfectly okay with it because his job isn't going to be, hey, line up over the center and attack the ball. His job is going to be, hey, line up in the A-gap and penetrate. So based on what his job is, I'm down with it. It's basically what they wanted Pere Jerry to do as a rookie. And from then on.
Okay. Yeah. I don't love it, but, it became very clear after that first week of free agency where the Falcons basically made no attempt to get a veteran nose tackle in there, that was their plan moving forward. Based off what Jarrett did at the end of last season playing the nose tackle, I do think the Falcons might be a little bit more vulnerable against the run, especially now if they're going to have Deion Jones starting at middle linebacker. I do think there's the potential there. I think Grady Jarrett has the potential to be a good nose tackle. Unless he's made significant improvements since week 16 or so in that, I don't think he's going to be quite there yet. I sort of also think that ideally his ideal usage this year is basically as a situational interior pass rusher, playing beside Jonathan Babineau on third downs and nickel sub packages, and doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. He's going to be more of a base down guy, which, you know, that means our base defensive line is going to be much more effective rushing the quarterback with him out there. But I do think it may take a step back in run defense, and Grady's going to be fine. Like, I'm not worried about Grady Jarrett's potential and development. I think he's ultimately going to be fine, but I think maybe the Falcons might be rushing this move a little faster, maybe a year or two earlier than they need to, but we'll see how it goes.
I think they're looking at it as this year. How do I put it? This year versus taking some lumps this year versus having a perfect, absolutely perfect defense next year. Like, I think their defense next year is going to be a lot better than it was this year.
Well, that's the plan, I guess. That's the goal. Always get better.
And I think by making sure that Jarrett takes the lumps, you got to have a guy. Like, when Brandon Mabane wasn't what he was as a second-year player or as a rookie, he's closer to basically what Grady was this year. An undersized interior defensive lineman. He was good, but he wasn't like, oh my God, that guy's the guy that needs to play right away. And I think that's how you get Grady better. I think Grady's definitely better than, at least as a pass rusher, than what we've had in the middle there.
Yeah, that's definitely a fact, yeah.
And I think the overall goal is for the nickel set to have Shelby and Babineau on the inside.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I can see why the Falcons sort of envision Grady in this Brandon Mebane sort of role, but Mebane in his second year, was a starter as a rookie. Started 10 games as a rookie. In his second year, had 5.5 sacks. I think he might have led the Seahawks in sacks that year. Let me check. Yeah, he tied for the lead with sacks, 5.5 sacks that year. They didn't have a great pass rush. So, I feel like Grady can get there, but I think that's probably what he is next year as opposed to this year. But we'll see how it goes. And if, as Scott said, he's got to take his lumps to get there, then so be it. And in the long run, it works out for the Falcons. But, I personally, if I was, envisioning how I maximize Grady Jarrett's skill set this year, I want him to be a 300, 400 snap situational pass rusher on the inside, basically doing what Adrian Claiborne did last year. That's what I want his role to be this year. But, the Falcons are going to do this, and, Grady is certainly good enough that he can certainly surprise me and really outperform my expectations. I wouldn't be shocked by that because I'm never shocked by what anybody with Jesse Tuggle's bloodlines can do in the NFL. So, okay. ATL Sports 404 asks, could we see more no-huddle offense this year now that the players are familiar with the scheme?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Especially with a center who knows how to read a defense and do some line calls right up front and say, hey, block that guy, as opposed to a center like Mike Person who had no idea what the hell he was doing. So, just my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's like if we don't see more no huddle, I think Kyle Shanahan needs to hire 24/7 bodyguards because people in Atlanta are going to be wanting his head on a stake. So, I think Shanahan has to be. I do think Matt Ryan has some ways that he's got to improve his game, but I do feel like Shanahan has to meet him at least halfway by letting them dictate more at the line of scrimmage than he did last year. And if they don't do that, then it's hard for me imagining this offense being significantly better than what it was last year without more no huddle. So I know Kyle Shanahan's life might be in danger if they don't run more no huddle because people are frothing at the mouth if they don't do that. So we got a couple of questions about what we thought about other teams that drafted well, and a couple of questions about NFC South teams in particular. Who had the best and worst draft in the NFC South? I actually have to look at those guys' picks because I didn't pay a ton of attention to them.
I didn't either. I mean, overall, I thought the Saints. I'm gonna get flack for this because I fucking hate the Saints, but I thought the Saints actually did have a good draft. They went out and they got the best interior pass rusher in Sheldon Rankins. They got a solid number 2 wide receiver in Michael Thomas. He's like Michael Jenkins. Von Bell, I mean, he's okay. They needed someone at safety to help out and someone at corner to help out. Onyemata, I mean, he's terrible, but whatever. And then Lasco's friggin' great at running back. Lasco's going to be a pain in the ass for the Falcons this year. Think of faster, stronger Pierre Thomas. So that's going to be fun.
Fun.
I didn't really like the Panthers draft. I thought it was stupid to take 3 mediocre level corners in the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th. Bo Sandlin kind of blows. I mean, the only good pick they had was Vernon Butler. Vernon Butler's a beast. And then the Buccaneers, they had an up and down draft. I love the pick of Vernon Hargreaves. I love the pick of Spence. And then they trade up for a fucking kicker. Like, how stupid can you be? One, you draft a kicker in the 2nd round. That alone is just fucking dumb. But then they traded up for him? Like, kickers are not that important, nor will they ever be that important. A guy who's going to play maximum 80 snaps for you is not worth a 2nd round pick. A guy like Noah Spence, who's going to play 450, 500 snaps, even as a rookie for you, is worth that pick. Hell, even Ryan Smith in the 4th round is going to play more snaps this year than Robert Aguayo is. Caleb Benenoch in the 5th round will probably play more snaps than Aguayo will this year. I don't know about Bond. Hell, Dan Vitale, their fullback that they drafted. I know Aaron's against drafting fullbacks, but their fullback that they drafted, who's a great athlete, a good special teamer, will play more than 80 snaps this year when you combine his special teams, his offensive, everything together. He'll probably play 300 snaps this year. A kicker is not worth it.
Yeah, I know where you're coming from with that. I would tend to not, I'm very much against drafting fullbacks. I'm generally against drafting kickers and punters. But I will say that if Aguayo basically has the same impact that Matt Bryant had back in 2009 coming out the gates, then it is worth it. Because that's 3 or 4 wins, and that's the difference between being 7-9 and making the playoffs. But I would have to say that if I'm looking at the rest of the NFC South, Tampa Bay, because they drafted a fullback and a kicker, that's a bunch of red flags in my book. I don't know much about James Bradbury. I've heard good things about him. I saw Darryl Worley while I was watching other better players at West Virginia, and picking him in the 3rd round is rough, especially given the whole issue with him having some off-field baggage. That's rough. So I didn't love Carolina's draft. If Bradbury's good, then Sanchez is okay. But it was interesting to see Carolina do something they haven't done in nearly a decade, which is take defensive backs high. So if we're looking at the division, then I think by default, New Orleans had the best draft. Sheldon Rankins is a great pick. I think he's going to be a nightmare for the Falcons offensive line for the next 7 to 10 years. I like Von Bell. He's not a superstar, but I think he can be an Antoine Bethea type of NFL player. They really went after athleticism because Bell is probably the worst athlete out of all the guys they drafted, and he's not a terrible athlete. He's just okay. Onyemata's I think he's like a spark superstar. Lasco's a spark superstar. I don't know where Michael Thomas. I'm sure he's up there pretty high, and he's going to be that Marcus Colston type of guy. So pretty solid draft. I think they maximized, getting value in the first 2 rounds with the Saints. So I think they had the best draft. And elsewhere in the league, I gotta love what Jacksonville did. I think they arguably got the 2 best players in the draft with Jalen Ramsey and Miles Jack. And
I love Jacksonville's draft. Oh my God, Jalen Ramsey and Miles Jack are great, but Yannick Ngakoue, he's a great fit for the scheme. Sheldon Day's a great fit for that 5 tech. Tyrone Holmes was my sleeper. I said if Tyrone Holmes is there in the 6th round, the Falcons don't take him, they're stupid. I stand by that. The only pick that I think that they made that was bad was Brandon Allen. Because I think Brandon Allen is just garbage. But, I mean, one bad pick out of what? They had 8 picks, 7 picks. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So out of 7 picks, they had 1 pick that I consider bad. But every other pick is an A+. Like, that's an A draft right there. That's a great draft.
Yeah, man.
All pass rushers. And then
Jack. Yeah. So I think, there's a good chance that our Falcons streak of picking up ex-Jaguars is going to continue because they're not going to be able to keep all the decent pass rushers. They got about 10 guys that are NFL caliber defensive linemen that can play in this league. Maybe not all of them can play at a high level, but they're going to end up cutting some guys. Tyson Alualu, Roy Miller, maybe Senderick Marks, Ryan Davis, Quanterus Smith. Some of these guys are going to get cut because I just can't imagine them keeping all those guys on the roster. Hey, maybe we can get Joplo Bartu back. He's on the Jaguars. So, I think, Jacksonville, keep an eye. If you guys are watching Jacksonville preseason games, check out, those 2nd and 3rd quarters of Jaguars games to see which pass rushers stand out because a couple of those guys could be some waiver wire pickups from the Falcons. We got a couple of questions about undrafted free agents. ATL Sports 404 asks, are there any UDFAs that have a good chance of making the final roster? And Big Boy Brewski and Gemini Unruly ask about were there any undrafted free agents that we think the Falcons should bring in?
I mean, I don't know who the Falcons signed as undrafted free agents. Ideally, they would have brought in Marquez North, Eric Stryker. Those 2 guys alone are worth it. I don't want them to bring in Sean Oakman just because I think he's an asshole off the field. He's not worth it. Other than that, I can't really think of anybody who's special, like just a truly special football player. I mean, I like Kurt Magid out of Tennessee. If they can get him, I'd be happy. But, again, I have no idea who signed where. I have no idea who signed with Atlanta. I don't even speculate about undrafted free agents until they're official because I just don't care enough. I hate to say it that way, but the Falcons are going to sign 23 guys. We'll see in camp how they look. 3 of them will be worth keeping.
Yeah, the Falcoholic has a list of guys that have been reported, and only really 3 of them I've ever really heard of prior to the Falcons, like Brian Poole, Sherrod Niesman, and Jordan Walsh.
He's been pretty solid.
He's a good athlete. I'll be curious whether we play him as a safety or a cornerback. Walsh is good. I think if I'm looking at the Falcons roster, where they're probably the most vulnerable. I mean, basically, undrafted free agents. It's all about where you're weakest at the position. And I think for the Falcons, you look at their roster, it's overwhelmingly cornerback. That's where any halfway decent try to make it as a 4th or 5th corner, which is basically the same situation it was last year with guys like Kevin White and whatnot. So I think maybe Walsh as an interior offensive lineman. Maybe if a decent tight end sort of shows up and can play special team, might be able to take that third tight end spot behind Hooper and Tammy. You know, any decent pass rusher, edge rusher might be able to sort of sneak onto the back end of the roster.
Chris May's out of Georgia, nose tackle. He's pretty good. He might be able to take a spot in a rotational sense. At least when they need to run their big packages where it's got 3 defensive tackles right up the middle on the goal line set. You can see Mays make the roster there. I personally I'm looking at this list that's on the Falcoholic. I personally don't really care for many of these guys. I like Jamal Golden out of Georgia Tech, but that's not really saying much. Josh Dawson's okay. There really isn't anybody who's worth a damn on this entire list that I think will make the roster, be an impact player, like anything crazy. I like Brian Poole for depth. I like Will Rattel for depth. But, these are depth as in practice squad guys. I don't see anything great. The best guy that they might have is Brandon Wilds. I would love to see Brandon Wilds make the team because I think he's ridiculously better than Ron Ward. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So our next question is about, basically the roster and the state of the roster. Jelani234 asks, so what other positions do you see the Falcons going to address since the draft is over? And I think their biggest weaknesses right now are on the defensive line, getting another body or two, whether that's getting an edge rusher like a Brian Schofield or a better 5 technique than Tyson Jackson to play behind Shelby, to bring in extra competition for Malachi Goodman there, and cornerback. I think those are, they probably need to sign at least 4 more corners to have a decent camp competition because right now they really only have 2 guys on the roster. And between Collins, Van Dyke, and Akeem King, you might get 1 decent backup out of that 3-man group. So, you need 4 or 5 corners to make it through an NFL season. So I would say cornerback, go out there, get Leon Hall, go out there, get Jared Powers, get, some of these guys, some veteran guys, just keep them as bodies, bring competition, add some veteran leadership in the locker room, bring in Peanut Tillman and tell him to, teach Jalen Collins a couple of things. And, that'll be beneficial, I think.
I think they need to get a nickel corner. I'd love to see Cortez Allen come in just because he's my boy. I'd love to see a guy like Dom Easley brought in. There's some talent out there. I'm trying to find a list of best available NFL free agents right now. Just to see what's out there, just to see what's available. I'd like to see, top free agents for 2016. I just don't know if there's anything that's really worth it right now. Outside of Dom Easley. I think Dom Easley's worth it. I think Cortez Allen's worth it. I don't think there's a ton of stuff out there at corner outside of Allen. You've got Leon Hall, who'd be fun. Maybe Cromartie, but I don't want to pay for Cromartie because Cromartie's expensive. He's got 19 kids.
He does not play for cheap.
I know. And then Walter Thurman. Walter Thurman's still out there. I'd bring him in a heartbeat.
Sounds like he's going to retire, though.
Oh, yeah, he's totally going to retire. Otherwise, he would have signed with somebody by now.
Yeah.
And then bring back Schofield. I don't see why you wouldn't.
Yeah, we got some mailbag questions specifically asking about Schofield. And, basically, what do you think the chances are that we keep Schofield?
I think if the Falcons make an offer, a legitimate, 2-year, $4 million offer, Schofield comes back like that. all day, every day.
Yeah, I mean, I think the odds went up certainly because the Falcons didn't get a pass rusher in this draft, and they were last week that he was going to we had this question a couple of shows ago, and I think Scott and I both agreed that the chances that he'd come back were very low at that point. But I think at that time we were sort of thinking the Falcons were going to get a pass rusher in this year's draft, and not getting that guy, and that sort of brings in the next question, which is. Charlie Rogers 68 says Dan Quinn has confidence that our pass rush will be better than with who we have. What do you guys think? I mean, I think it's law of averages is it can't get worse. You can do worse than 19 sacks. I hope not. But do I think the Falcons are going to suddenly become like a team that gets 35, 40 sacks this year with the guys they currently have? No, I don't think they're that close. So. I do think we'll probably see Beasley at least double his sack total. Hopefully, Claiborne playing D in the entire season, he'll double his sack total. We'll see Grady Jarrett get more sacks and Babineau and Shelby. But probably at the end of the day, you're still looking at probably a 30-sack defense, which isn't bad. It's certainly improvement. But it's not going to be like, oh, man, this is a great pass rush or anything like that. So, what do you.
I think adding Shelby is going to be a lot bigger than people realize. I think he's a solid 6 to 8 sack kind of guy. I think if they bring back Schofield, that would help out a lot. I think Vic Beasley is going to take that step and become that 8 to 10 sack guy this year. I think Hageman is going to take a step, and maybe he won't be a 5 sack guy, but he'll probably be a 3 sack guy this year. And I think Grady Jarrett will take a step up and probably be a 3 or 4 sack guy. Babineau is going to be Babineau. Claiborne's going to get some more sacks just because he's in a better role than playing inside. I think he's better outside at the right end than he is inside as a defensive tackle. And who knows, maybe Tyson Jackson surprises us and gets his first sack in 6 years. Maybe that happens.
Maybe.
That'd be amazing. I don't think it happens, but, I mean, it'd be better than nothing, right?
For whatever reason, I think there's no chance that I can't imagine a world where he's on the roster week 1. I just can't imagine that at all. But we'll see what happens. Crazier things have happened.
So you're like me in that you just don't see a role for him on this team in the future.
I mean, I think he could play a role, but I think the problem is, what is his salary? Like $6 million or something like that?
It's
and if you're on the roster. If you're on the roster week 1, your salary is guaranteed for the year, and it just doesn't make any sense for the Falcons unless they're convinced that he's one of the 4 best defensive linemen on the team, and you probably would have to be smoking crack to think that. Why would you pay a guy that guaranteed that much money to a backup? So I don't know why he's still on the team, but
I think they want him to earn it in camp, and if he doesn't earn it in camp, he's gone. That's been my theory the whole time. He's got to earn his roster spot in camp. I think if they bring in Dom Easley for cheap, he's gone, like straight up gone. Once camp is done, like first cuts, he'll be one of the first cuts. But if you take his money and you cut him, you cut Hester, you cut Weems, now the Falcons are looking at what? $65 million under the cap next year, Aaron?
Something like that, yeah.
Something ridiculous, right in the range of what the Jaguars had this past year. And then all the talent that they have on the team is going to be young. It's going to be guys that are, you may not love Sanu, but he'll be 27. Julio Jones will be 27. Looking at the roster, the oldest guy on the roster next year will be Matt Ryan, probably. Unless Bryant comes back, then he'll, be it by default because he'll be 45, but exaggerating, of course. He'll be 45, but I mean, you get rid of Tyson Jackson and Alex Mack and Matt Ryan as far as the old guys. I mean, those are the only guys even under contract for next year that are slated to be over 30 outside of Matt Bryant. Mack and Ryan obviously aren't going anywhere because they're key contributors, but Jackson's not important. Matt Bryant probably is going to retire. I would be shocked if he didn't retire. I don't see it happening. So, I don't see him playing a what is it, 17th year in the NFL, even as a kicker. Yeah, it's up there. Like, so you got Matt Ryan, you got Julio Jones, you got Mohamed Sanu, you got Devontae Freeman, you got a bunch of guys still on their rookie contracts. Your most expensive lineman is Andy Levitre, who may even be getting cut. Falcons are going to have a ridiculous amount of money next year in free agency. That's a big reason why I keep saying I don't see Alford leaving. I don't see Alford leaving. Just because they're going to have the money to keep whoever they want. And then when you take out Jackson's $4.25 million next year as well, you're looking at over $70 million under the cap. That's insane, Aaron. I mean, that's just a ridiculous number.
They're going to spend it.
Spend it, but they're going to have – I mean, who do they have to re-sign? Like, honestly, who do they have to go out and re-sign after this year? When you look at their roster, Tammy's going to be cheap. Schrader, I mean, he's a right tackle. You give him $4 million a year. They've got their center. They've got their starting left tackle signed for right now. Tyson Jackson, cut him. You don't have to worry about him. Hageman, Jarrett, Shelby, Claiborne, all those guys are under contract. Brooks Reed, Vic Beasley, they're under contract. Deion Jones, Devondre Campbell, they're under contract. Trufant Collins, under contract. Alford, you got to sign Alford. You got to sign, Ricardo Allen. But even then, you're not talking about a lot of money. You're talking maybe $10 million of next year's cap. So they'll have about $60 million to spend if they cut Tyson Jackson and Devin Hester and Eric Weems. And that's stupid money. That's way too much in a lot of people's views to trust Thomas Dimitroff with. But when you look at the cap situation, you look at the fact that the Falcons got a lot younger, a lot quicker. And yeah, there's a lot of talent that's missing on the team. But there's a lot of talent that's on the team too. You got a starting center, you got a starting left tackle, you got a number one wide receiver, you got a franchise quarterback, you got a franchise pass rusher, you got a franchise corner. I mean, you got all the key positions, all the bases really hit to where you might as well just go best player available in the draft. You might as well go out there and sign the guys who are worth it in free agency. I mean, I don't know what 2017's free agency class looks like, and I'm about to go on the Spotrac and check it real quick. But Falcons could be so much better heading into 2017 than they are heading into 2018 or 2016. I'm just looking at free agents.
I think they're going to have a lot of cap space, and I think they're going to be in a situation where they're going to be similar to the Jaguars, where people are going to be talking about them spending a bunch of that on new guys coming in. Because I think there's going to be, after this season, there's going to be a lot of positions of concern for the Falcons roster.
Well, just looking at the defensive line class that's coming out in 2017, that's out of their first contract. You're going to have Michael Brockers, Calais Campbell, Muhammad Wilkerson, Cameron Wake. Not Cameron Wake. Cameron Wake's okay, but Jason Pierre-Paul, Fletcher Cox. All those guys are going to be worth going after. Looking at linebackers, Von Miller is going to be listed out there, even if he doesn't actually hit it. You might see DeMarcus Ware hit it. Chandler Jones might be out there. If Chandler Jones is out there, the Falcons will have the money to go get him, and he's definitely worth it. Melvin Ingram, Dante Hightower, or Kiki Mingo. I know you're not a huge fan of Kiki, but he'll be out there. Trent Cole, Robert Mathis, Perry Riley, Nick Perry, Ninkovich, Eric Walden, Lawson. I mean, there's going to be guys out there. Malcolm Smith should be available at the ripe old age of 26. He'd be available. Robert Alford is probably the headliner for that cornerback class. And then you got guys like Stephon Gilmore, Drake Patrick. Amukamara is going to be back out next year. Captain Wonderland. I mean, there's talent out there that's just for the taking next year. Even just looking at free safeties, if Eric Berry makes it to free agency and the Falcons don't go after him, it doesn't make sense. If Harrison Smith goes out to free agency, it just doesn't make sense to not go after these guys. So they'll have the money to. And I realize that a lot of people are probably going to look at this show and go, oh, well, Scott's just getting crazy here. But if they could go get Kevin Zeitler, they need to go get Kevin Zeitler. If you've got $70 million of money to spend, you need to spend at least 40 of it on guys that will help your roster. Get some big-name free agents that people are going, oh, man, this guy's available. I mean, let's look at the wide receivers. Alshon Jeffrey legitimately maybe under another franchise tag. But if the Bears get Kevin White to do what he's supposed to, he'll be a 27-year-old wide receiver hitting the open market. I don't know about you, but I'd be perfectly okay with bringing in Alshon Jeffrey. Especially even if it costs just as much as Julio did. I'd be more than okay with it.
Okay.
Keenan Allen will be out there. Let's see who else. Kenny Stills. Tight end. I mean, you'll have Jordan Cameron back out on the market. You'll have Martellus Bennett back out on the market. You'll have Jared Cook back out on the market. The Falcons showed interest in Cook this offseason. He just chose to go up to Green Bay. Jordan Reed will be on the market. I realize he's not everybody's favorite player, but he's a solid football player. Michael Rivera from Oakland will be on the market. So they're going to have the money to go after talent at quite a few different positions. They can re-sign the important players. They can go out and get a right tackle like Riley Reif if Reif gets out of Detroit. Or if Luke Jekyll for whatever reason, Luke Jekyll leaves Jacksonville because Jacksonville just doesn't want to keep him. Why not bring him here, play him on the right side?
Okay. Yeah, I don't disagree. I think, look, this is kind of probably one of our last mailbag questions with someone asking us what we think that the record's going to be. But I don't think the Falcons' season is going to go particularly well as a lot of people hope it will in terms of them being a playoff team. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on them to spend the ample amount of cap space they have next year to basically get Dan Quinn and his team into the playoffs in 2017. Because I do feel like there's a decent chance that he'll enter that season on the hot seat because that's just kind of the way it is. Big Boy Bruce, he asked, even though it's too early, thoughts on our record by the end of the season. And, I think best case scenario, just like it was before the draft, I say 8-8, but it's probably going to be somewhere around 7-9, 6-10-ish, I think, for the Falcons this year. So.
And I'm going to say, just like before the draft, I still see them as a 9-17. I think it's a winning record. I think they miss a playoff by one game. And I think that based on the schedule, that'll be good enough.
Okay. And last question.
And as of a minute ago, breaking news, Falcons are bringing in Leon Hall for a visit. So there you go. There's a guy who can come in and be a solid nickel guy because that's all he's really been his whole career.
Okay. Good.
Thanks to Evan Birchfield, by the way.
Yeah, appreciate it, Evan. Last question of the night, I think, is from ATL Sports 404. He says, considering free agency in the draft, how much did the Falcons improve their team this offseason?
I may not seem like I'm super high on a lot of the moves they've made, but they drastically improved it based on the scheme. I know Aaron's not super high on a lot of the moves they've made, but I think their defense is way better. Derek Shelby's huge. Outside of nose tackle, I think they've improved at pretty much every spot that they've had an addition. Bringing in Shelby, bringing back Claiborne, bringing in Jones and Campbell, bringing in Keanu Neal. Because William Moore was done last year. There's a reason why no one is looking at him right now. I thought bringing in Alex Mack for offense was huge. Bringing in Wes Schweitzer for depth, bringing in Tom Compton for depth, that's helpful. I'd like to see him bring back Jake Long, just because I thought Jake Long did a good job as depth to tackle last year. And you can never have enough good offensive linemen. And I think 13 and 14 kind of prove that. You can never have enough good offensive linemen. I thought they improved wide receiver a little bit. I do think Sanu now is better than White was last year. I know Aaron probably disagrees with me there, but I thought White was just the worst wide receiver in the NFL last year. And I think Sanu has potential to be at least an average number 2, which even if that's all he is in Atlanta, that's an upgrade. I think Justin Hardy's a solid number 3. I think Devin Fuller can be a solid number 4. I think Levitri Chester coming back is not a bad fit. If Mac is healthy all year, I think it's going to be a perfectly good offensive line. I like that they kept Schrader. I like that they brought in Austin Hooper and gave Ryan another weapon. The only real questions that I have come down to, will it continue? Will they start Courtney Upshaw? Will they start Brooks Reed? Like, who's going to be the starting defense? Who's going to be the starting guys? But one thing I will say is they brought in competition everywhere. At defensive tackle, there was already competition there between Grady Jarrett and Hageman and Mbu and Babineau. They brought in a bunch of undrafted guys to defensive tackle that are going to compete. At defensive end, Shelby, Beasley, Claiborne, Jackson, Goodman, Upshaw. If they bring back Schofield, I mean, there's guys there for competition. At middle linebacker, you're going to have Campbell. You're going to have Jones, Warlow, Reynolds. At weak side linebacker, you're going to have Campbell, Weatherspoon, Wheeler. Like, you're going to have competition this year. And that alone is worth having. And I think they vastly improved the key spot in defense, which is strong safety. I think if you don't have that right guy for strong safety, you're done.
Okay. You guys probably know what I'm going to say. I don't think they've improved their roster to a huge degree. I think Hooper, Mack, and Shelby are probably the 3 additions that I would sit here and say are significant upgrades over what they had last year at that same position. I think a lot of the other guys that they got, I think are, you can make a case that Sanu is better. I would say Sanu is probably better than Roddy White. I think he's probably better than Leonard Hankerson, but probably not by the degree that probably a lot of people think he is. I think they got younger at a lot of spots, so I do think the potential is there for them to be much stronger 2-3 years down the road than what they are today because they added some young pieces. But, I like Keanu Neal, but I'm not going to expect him to come in week 1 and be a massive upgrade over what William Moore is. We saw last year with, last year's rookie class, which was, one of the best that we've seen in recent Falcons history. And ultimately, you're not looking at those guys coming in and setting the world on fire because rookies typically don't set the world on fire. They're usually like a good rookie is basically an average NFL starter. So I feel like the Falcons have started to lay a foundation for success down the road, but I don't think it's going to quite come to fruition to the degree that I think a lot of people are expecting this season. Maybe 2017, maybe 2018. I think that's when some of these moves start to pay off big dividends for them. But, I think in order to make up the difference that their schedule is going to make, the toughness of their schedule, I don't quite think they improved to the degree that they needed to in a lot of areas. But I think they improved in certain areas, and as long as some of their better players, you get Matt Ryan to play at a high level, you get a healthy season from Julio Jones, there's no drop-off in Devontae Freeman, Tevin Coleman steps up, Jarrett steps up, you get certain young guys to step up and become more than just average starters and start to become more impactful starters, then I think the Falcons will improve this year but I don't necessarily know it's because of the players that they added this offseason. But I do think a couple of guys that they added the last offseason and the last couple of off seasons could make a difference this year. So, guys, that is our show. It was a long one, but, we had a lot of stuff to unpack because of the draft. And, it's a lot of, now that the draft is finally over, the offseason sort of settles into this whatever it is for the next 3 months until training camp is. And we will look forward to you guys sending in more mailbag questions because that sort of helps us guide what we talk about in these upcoming shows because probably there's not going to be a whole lot going on other than maybe the Falcons signing a veteran like Leon Hall or whatnot. So if you guys want to send in and submit your mailbag questions, use the hashtag Falcons Mailbag. Send a tweet my way at FalcFans. Send it at Scott's way at Karasik S. You can tweet the show at Falcons PFC. Be sure to subscribe and rate and review us on iTunes. Check us out over at ProFootballCentral.com. I will be having scouting reports over the next 6 or so weeks. I'm hoping I can get out at least one guy a week over that span. So you can sort of get more of my in-depth thoughts on these picks. And, I reserve the right to change my opinion. Maybe I'll wind up being higher on some of these guys that I'm not as high on, like Deion Jones, after I really go in and dive deep on like 8 games as opposed to the 2 or 3 that I've seen so far. And maybe I might come up not as optimistic about another guy after a deeper dive. So look forward to that. And Scott, do you have anything upcoming for yourself that you want to plug?
Yeah, I've got a couple articles I'm working on. They're not all going to be Falcons related, but I do have an article related to the instant impact NFL rookies. I do mention Keanu Neal on there, so look out for that. I probably will do a quick review on the Falcons draft eventually on Sportsnot. It's not going to be a heavy hitter, so I'm not really too worried about it right now. Hate to say it, guys, I'm going for some clicks. No offense. It's just where life is right now. More clicks, more cash, saving up for something important.
Well, there you go. All right, guys, that's our show, and we hope to see you guys back next week, and we'll talk more about the Falcons and what we do.